When Sarah and her husband Jack found the apartment, it felt like a gift from the universe itself. They'd been searching for months, growing increasingly desperate as rejection after rejection piled up. Each no felt like another nail in the coffin of their dreams of building a life together in the city. They'd only been married a year, still basking in that newlywed glow, while simultaneously wrestling with the harsh realities of making ends meet. Every month was a careful dance of budgeting and compromise, stretching dollars until they screamed. Sarah had just started her new job at Wellington Publishing downtown, a junior editor position that promised growth, but started with a salary that barely covered their basic needs. Jack had been piecing together an income through freelance construction work, taking whatever jobs he could find in the city's endless maze of renovation projects. His hands were always rough now, calloused from countless hours of manual labor, but his smile never dimmed when he talked about their future. So when they stumbled across this cozy, pre-war apartment with its impossibly low rent, just 2 blocks from her office, it seemed almost too good to be true. The building itself was a beautiful old brownstone, its facade weathered but dignified, with intricate moldings that spoke of a more elegant era. The rental price was so far below market value that Sarah had initially assumed it was a typo. But no, the landlord, a distracted-looking man named Mr. Peterson, assured them it was correct. "Just looking for the right tenants," he'd mumbled, barely making eye contact as he handed them the keys. Something in his manner should have given Sarah pause, but they were too relieved, too eager to finally have a place to call their own. But from the moment they moved in, something felt off. It wasn't anything Sarah could put her finger on at first, just a persistent unease that seemed to hover at the edges of her consciousness. The first thing she noticed was the cold. It wasn't the normal chill you might expect in an old building. This was different, more invasive somehow. Even with the ancient radiators clanking and hissing at full blast, the place maintained a bone-deep coldness that no amount of heating seemed to touch. It was particularly bad in the back room, the one with the mysterious little attic door tucked away in the corner, like an afterthought. That attic door fascinated and unsettled Sarah in equal measure. It was a simple wooden door, maybe 3 feet high, with an old-fashioned brass lock that seemed unusually sturdy for what they assumed was just a utility closet. The wood around the lock was darker than the rest of the door, as if countless hands had touched it over the years, testing its strength. The back room was supposed to be Jack's office. He needed a dedicated space for his laptop and drafting table, somewhere he could work on estimates and blueprints for his construction projects. But he could barely stand to be in there for more than an hour at a time. "Feels like a freezer in here," he'd mutter, his breath visible in the air as he rubbed his hands together and shook his head, like someone left a window open in the Arctic. But all the windows were sealed tight, and the radiator in that room worked just as hard as the others. Over the next few weeks, the small things started accumulating, like pieces of a puzzle Sarah didn't want to solve. It's remarkably easy to rationalize away the unexplainable, especially when the alternative is too unsettling to contemplate. Every old building has its quirks, she told herself. The keys that somehow migrated from her purse to the fruit bowl. She must have absent-mindedly placed them there while juggling groceries. The lights that flickered in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Just the ancient wiring showing its age. But then it got weirder, and the comfortable explanations began to wear thin. One night, Sarah woke up to a sound that would become horrifyingly familiar. A faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the walls. It wasn't the random knocking of settling pipes or expanding wood. No, this had a purpose to it, a pattern that spoke of consciousness. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 slow ones. Over and over, like someone trying to communicate in some forgotten code. Groggy and disoriented, she nudged Jack, who responded with an incomprehensible mumble and rolled over, pulling the blankets tighter around himself. Sarah lay there in the darkness, listening to that persistent tapping, trying to convince herself it was just the building's nocturnal symphony. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more, something intentional, like someone desperately knocking to be let out of a space too small for human habitation. The incidents began to escalate, each one harder to explain away than the last. One afternoon, while Jack was out on a job site across town, Sarah was cleaning the kitchen, losing herself in the mundane rhythm of wiping counters and organizing cabinets. As she worked, she gradually became aware of a presence behind her, that prickling sensation of being watched that sets off ancient alarm bells in our primitive brains. She turned around slowly, her heart already picking up speed, and noticed the door to the back room standing ajar. She froze, a dish towel clutched in her suddenly trembling hands. She knew. They'd kept it closed. They always kept it closed, an unspoken agreement between Jack and her, as if by shutting that door they could contain whatever lurked behind it. Maybe the latch is loose, she whispered to herself, her voice sounding thin and unconvincing in the empty apartment. She forced herself to walk over and push it shut, trying to ignore the way the temperature dropped with each step closer to that room. As she stepped back, something caught her eye. Tiny parallel scratches in the wood, barely visible unless you knew where to look. They started about halfway up the door and curved downward, as if someone, or something, had been clawing at it from the inside, desperate to escape. Sarah could almost see it in her mind's eye, fingernails breaking against the wood, splitting and bleeding as they dug deeper and deeper, driven by a terror she couldn't begin to comprehend. She shuddered and retreated to the kitchen, but the image stayed with her, burning itself into her thoughts. That night, the cold was worse than ever. It seemed to have a weight to it, a presence that went beyond mere temperature. Even in their bedroom, supposedly the warmest room in the apartment, Sarah could feel it seeping in from the hallway, like something alive and malevolent crawling through the air itself. Jack noticed it too, which was somehow more frightening than any of the strange occurrences she'd experienced alone. It meant she wasn't imagining things, wasn't just letting an overactive imagination run wild in a new place. "You feel that?" he asked, pulling the blankets up to his chin like a child trying to hide from monsters. "It's like we're in the middle of a blizzard." His voice had a forced casualness to it, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension, the same unease that had been growing in her since they moved in. She nodded, trying to keep her voice steady as she suggested, "Maybe we should ask the landlord about the heating." It was a pathetically inadequate response to what they were experiencing, but it was safer than acknowledging the alternative. That something was fundamentally wrong with their apartment. Something that went beyond faulty heating systems and old pipes. Jack agreed, but like so many things that frighten us, they never got around to it. Life has a way of pushing the supernatural to the background, filling their days with deadlines and meetings and the thousand small tasks that make up normal existence. Still, the chill lingered, and that tapping sound became a regular feature of Sarah's nights, always faint, always emanating from the back room, always following that same pattern, 3 quick, 2 slow. Then came the day that changed everything. Sarah came home early from work, having begged off with a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. The apartment was quiet in that peculiar way that suggests it's not really empty at all. The shadows from the late afternoon sun stretched across the walls like grasping fingers, and the air felt thick with anticipation. She went into the kitchen, driven by habit more than hunger, and there it was. A half-eaten sandwich on the counter, the bread slightly stale, the edges of the meat curling as if it had been sitting there for hours. She stopped dead, staring at it as if it might suddenly sprout legs and scuttle away. Jack was working late that day. She just texted with him about it, and she hadn't made any food since breakfast. As she leaned closer, a sharp, musty odor hit her, a smell that didn't belong in any living space, rotting wood and damp earth, with an underlying sweetness that reminded her horrifyingly of decomposition. It was the smell of old graves and forgotten spaces, of things that should have been left undisturbed. Sarah backed out of the kitchen, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The rational part of her mind tried desperately to construct explanations. Maybe she had made the sandwich and forgotten. Maybe Jack had come home for lunch. Maybe a neighbor had somehow gotten in. But deep down, she knew none of those explanations fit. Something was living in their apartment. Something that ate and moved and watched them when they weren't looking. When Jack got home, she told him about the sandwich, watching his face carefully as the words spilled out. He looked at her with a mixture of concern and skepticism that made her stomach twist. "You're sure you didn't make it?" he asked, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe during lunch?" "Of course I didn't," she snapped, the fear making her voice sharp. "I know what I did and didn't do today, Jack." He rubbed his temples, a gesture she'd come to recognize as his response to stress. "Maybe you just forgot. You've been working a lot lately, under a lot of pressure with that new manuscript." His voice trailed off as he saw the expression on her face. Sarah wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe that she was just stressed, just forgetting things, just letting an old building and an overactive imagination get the better of her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in that apartment, that something was watching them, waiting for... what? That night, as they lay in bed pretending to sleep, she heard it. A whisper, so faint she might have missed it if she hadn't been lying there straining her ears for any unusual sound. It was a woman's voice, soft and desperate, coming from the direction of the back room. "Please, let me out." Sarah shot up in bed, her heart trying to hammer its way out of her chest. Jack was still sleeping beside her, his breathing deep and regular. She grabbed his shoulder, shaking him perhaps harder than necessary. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. He groaned, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. "Hear what?" "There's someone in the back room," she said, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "I heard a woman's voice." That got his attention. He sat up, suddenly alert, reaching for the baseball bat he'd started keeping beside the bed. Sarah hadn't commented when he'd first placed it there, understanding instinctively that he too had been feeling the wrongness of their home. He moved toward the back room with the cautious grace of someone expecting trouble, motioning for her to stay behind. She watched from the doorway of their bedroom as he slowly pushed open the door to the back room, his knuckles white around the bat's handle. The room was empty, of course, just the cold, silent darkness and that damned attic door, still locked tight when he rattled the handle. But something had changed in the atmosphere, as if their acknowledgement of the strange events had given them more power. "Nobody's here," he whispered, but his voice shook slightly, betraying his unease. They went back to bed, but sleep was impossible. Sarah lay there listening to the silence, feeling the cold creep closer, knowing that something was waiting just beyond the walls, watching and waiting, with infinite patience. The next morning, she called the landlord. Mr. Peterson sounded distracted as ever, barely engaging as she described the strange noises, the persistent cold, the feeling of being watched. But when she mentioned the attic door, his entire demeanor changed. "You said the attic door was locked, right?" he asked sharply, suddenly paying very close attention. "Yes," she replied, caught off guard by his shift in tone. "Why?" There was a long pause, filled with the sound of his breathing and what might have been papers shuffling. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with something that might have been guilt. "There was a tenant before you moved in. Young woman, about your age. She had some issues. Started saying strange things about the apartment. Said the walls were closing in on her, that something was trapping her. We thought she was having some kind of breakdown. Then one day she just Disappeared. We never found her. Just her things, like she'd vanished into thin air. Sarah's mouth went dry as cotton. Did you report her missing? He hesitated again, longer this time. Yes, but the police didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of foul play. They thought maybe she just left, had some kind of episode and took off. But some of her things are still in the attic. I thought it was best to just lock it up, Out of sight, out of mind. She hung up, her mind reeling with implications. The landlord's words echoed in her head. She thought something was trapping her. That night, Sarah reached her breaking point. She waited until Jack was asleep, his soft snores providing a counterpoint to the ever-present tapping from the walls. She crept out of bed, armed with a screwdriver she'd taken from Jack's toolbox, and made her way to the back room. The attic door seemed to loom larger in the darkness, its outline barely visible in the dim light filtering in from the street. She knelt before it, her hands shaking as she worked at the lock. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, it finally gave way with a soft click that seemed deafening in the midnight quiet. She pushed the door up slowly, grimacing at the wave of stale, musty air that rushed out. The attic space was cramped and dark, filled with the expected detritus of abandoned lives, old boxes, dust-covered furniture, forgotten memories. But in the center of it all, half buried in decades of dust, was a small notebook. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, its cover worn and water-stained. Inside, the handwriting started out neat and controlled, but gradually deteriorated, becoming more frantic and uneven with each entry. The words themselves told a story of descending madness, or perhaps terrible clarity. I can't breathe. They won't let me out. They're always watching me, waiting. The walls aren't what they seem. They're hungry. The entries grew more desperate, each page more unhinged than the last. The writer's grip on reality seemingly slipping away with each word. And on the final page, scratched so deeply into the paper that it had nearly torn through, was a single word: help. Sarah dropped the notebook, as if it had burned her, scrambling backward. The cold intensified, becoming almost solid in its presence, and suddenly the tapping was everywhere. Not just from the walls, but from above, below, all around her, growing louder and more insistent with each second. She ran from the attic, slamming the door shut with enough force to rattle the walls. She flew to the bedroom, shaking Jack awake with frantic urgency. We have to leave, she whispered, her voice cracking. Now. Something in her face must have convinced him. Perhaps he saw in her eyes the same terror that had been scratched into that notebook's pages. Without a word, he grabbed some essential items, and they left that apartment behind, not even bothering to close the door behind them. The next day, Sarah called Mr. Peterson and told him they were moving out. He didn't ask for an explanation, and she didn't offer one. As they drove away from that building for the last time, she felt the cold slowly recede, the sense of dread fading like a bad dream in morning light. But sometimes, in the deepest part of night, when the world is quiet and still, Sarah thinks she hears that faint tapping, and she can't help but wonder if the previous tenant is still there, trapped in those hungry walls, waiting for someone to finally let her out. Or perhaps, more terrifyingly, if she's become part of whatever lives within them, helping to lure the next tenants into that cold, watching darkness. Sarah tries not to think about what might have happened if they'd stayed just one more night. If they'd ignored the signs for too long, like she did. Some apartments come with history, they say, but some come with hunger, and the rent is far higher than anyone should be willing to pay. The Willowbrook orphanage had been closed for nearly 50 years, its walls crumbling, its windows shattered, and the grounds overtaken by weeds and vines. The old Victorian building loomed on the edge of town like a silent, forgotten monument, hidden behind twisted trees and overgrown shrubs. Its weathered brick facade, once a warm russet color, had faded to a sickly gray-brown, as if the very life had been drained from the structure itself. The ornate iron gates hung askew on rusted hinges, creaking mournfully in the wind, while tangles of ivy crept up the walls like grasping fingers. For years, it had been the subject of whispered stories, tales passed down through generations of locals about strange sounds, shadowy figures, and the spirit of a young girl who was said to haunt the place. Old Mrs. Patterson, who ran the local library, claimed her grandmother had worked there as a nurse in the 1970s, just before it closed. She spoke of unexplained footsteps in empty corridors, children's laughter echoing through vacant rooms, and doors that would slam shut without warning. But most disturbing were her accounts of the little girl in the white dress who would appear at the foot of beds late at night, watching the sleeping children with dark, hollow eyes. For James, Lisa, Danny, and Claire, Willowbrook was more than just an abandoned building. It was a rite of passage, a place everyone in town dared each other to explore. They had grown up hearing the stories, watching older kids sneak through the rusted gates on dare nights, their flashlight beams dancing through broken windows like desperate signals in the dark. The legend of the broken doll was what drew them there that night, just before Halloween, when the veil between worlds was said to be at its thinnest. According to the story, which had been whispered in school hallways and around campfires for decades, a little girl named Sarah Matthews had vanished from the orphanage the night before it closed. The official report claimed she had run away, but the other children told a different story. They spoke of strange noises coming from the attic that night, of Sarah's terrified screams, and of the doll they found the next morning. Its porcelain face cracked like a spider's web, its wide, lifeless eyes somehow knowing. They said the doll was still there, hidden somewhere in the attic, and that anyone who found it would hear Sarah's voice, asking them to stay with her forever. None of them truly believed the story, of course. James, with his practical nature and love of science, dismissed it as urban legend. Lisa, despite her fascination with the paranormal, approached it with skepticism. Danny, always the daredevil, saw it as nothing more than an opportunity for excitement. And Claire, sensitive and intuitive, tried to convince herself it was just another scary story. They were only there for the thrill, the adventure, the bragging rights. But as they stood outside the orphanage that October night, the cold wind whipping through the trees and carrying the scent of decay, a strange sense of unease settled over them like a heavy shroud. "Let's just get in and out," Lisa muttered, hugging her arms close to her chest. Her long dark hair whipped around her face in the wind, and her usual confidence seemed to falter. "This place gives me the creeps." She glanced up at the towering structure, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring down at them. Danny rolled his eyes, smirking, though there was a slight tremor in his voice that betrayed his nervousness. "Come on, it's just an old building. What's the worst that could happen?" He kicked at a loose stone, watching it skitter across the overgrown path. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. James shrugged, stepping up to the door and testing the handle. It was locked, of course, the metal cold and unyielding beneath his fingers. But a window nearby was broken, its jagged edges like teeth in a twisted mouth, and he climbed in first, the glass crunching beneath his feet. He helped the others through one by one, their movements careful and deliberate in the darkness. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the musty smell of abandonment. The walls were peeling, revealing layers of old wallpaper beneath, faded flowers, and cheerful patterns that seemed to mock the building's current state. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, each step echoing through the empty corridors like the building itself was groaning in pain. They flicked on their flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness like knives, casting eerie shadows across the empty hallways and broken furniture. Ancient chairs lay toppled, their stuffing spilling out like entrails. Tattered curtains hung like shrouds, stirring in the draft from the broken windows. The orphanage was silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the shattered panes, the creak of old wood settling, and something else, something that sounded almost like distant whispers. It felt like a place frozen in time, as if the children who had once lived there had simply vanished mid-moment, leaving their belongings behind to gather dust. In what must have been a common room, they found scattered toys, a wooden train with missing wheels, a headless doll, a jump rope coiled like a sleeping snake. On a shelf, a row of books sat undisturbed, their spines cracked and faded, titles barely legible in the beam of their flashlights. As they made their way through the building, they began to notice strange things that made their skin crawl. Drawings covered the walls, stick figures and childish scrawls of faces, some smiling, others distorted and strange. The words "Stay with me" appeared repeatedly, scrawled in different hands, some neat and careful, others frantic and desperate, as if carved into the walls with fingernails. "Creepy," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible as she traced one of the messages with trembling fingers. The paint was cold beneath her touch, and for a moment she thought she felt something. A pulse, a vibration, like the wall itself was alive. Danny laughed, but the sound was hollow, echoing through the empty halls. "It's just paint. Come on, let's check the attic." He moved toward the stairs, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls, illuminating more drawings, more messages, each one more disturbing than the last. They climbed the narrow staircase, the steps groaning beneath their weight, as if warning them to turn back. The air grew colder with each step, their breath visible in the beam of their flashlights. The attic was even darker than the rest of the building, the shadows deeper, more absolute, seeming to swallow their light. They fanned out, searching the dusty corners, the old trunks and boxes, the forgotten relics of a time long past. Old clothes hung from rafters like empty shells, swaying slightly though there was no breeze. Trunks filled with forgotten belongings sat like silent sentinels. Letters never sent, toys never played with, lives interrupted and abandoned. The dust was thick here, undisturbed for decades, and their footprints left clear trails behind them, like breadcrumbs in a dark forest. And then, in the far corner of the attic, Claire found it. The doll lay on an old chair, its face cracked like shattered ice, its eyes wide and glassy, staring straight ahead with an unsettling intensity. Its dress, once white, had yellowed with age, its lace trim delicate as spiderwebs. Its limbs were stiff, its tiny hands curled in its lap as if holding on to a secret. It was clearly handmade, with a painted face and thin, tangled hair that might once have been blonde. But something about it was deeply unsettling, a sense of wrongness that made Claire's skin crawl as she picked it up. "Look what I found!" she called, her voice trembling slightly as she held it up. The doll seemed heavier than it should be, as if weighted with something more than just porcelain and cloth. The others gathered around, their faces lit by the eerie glow of their flashlights as they stared at the doll. Its eyes seemed to glint in the light, almost as if they were watching, waiting, holding some terrible knowledge. The crack in its face ran from temple to chin, like a scar or a twisted smile. "That's it," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of their hearts. "The broken doll." She reached out to touch it but drew back at the last moment, as if afraid it might bite. James grinned, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "And here I thought it was just a story." He adjusted his glasses, peering closer at the doll's face. "It's just an old toy, probably left behind when the place closed." They all laughed, the tension breaking like a spell, but as Claire held the doll, a chill settled over her that had nothing to do with the cold. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she could have sworn she felt the doll move, just slightly, just enough to make her doubt her sanity. She brushed it off, forcing a smile, and they made their way back down the stairs, their footsteps echoing through the empty hallways like a countdown. But as they left, Claire thought she heard something. A faint, whispering voice, barely audible, drifting through the shadows like smoke. The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the space between heartbeats. "Stay with me." She froze, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird, but the others didn't seem to notice. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination, just the wind through the broken windows, just the natural sounds of an old building settling. She followed them out of the building, the doll still clutched in her hands, its weight seeming to increase with each step. That night, strange things began to happen, things that would make them question everything they believed about reality and the thin line between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. When Claire got home, she set the doll on her dresser, trying to ignore the way its cracked face seemed to watch her, its glassy eyes glinting in the dark like tiny mirrors. She tried to sleep, but the silence was heavy, oppressive, pressing down on her like a physical weight, filling her room with a cold, creeping dread that seemed to seep from the very walls. She was almost asleep when she heard it, a faint, whispering voice, drifting through the darkness like a cold breath across her skin. The words were clearer now, more insistent, filled with a loneliness that seemed to reach into her very soul. "Stay with me." Her eyes snapped open, her heart pounding so hard she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. Her gaze fixed on the doll, which sat exactly where she had left it, motionless, its face blank, its eyes wide and empty. Yet somehow, in the darkness, it seemed different, more alive, more aware. She told herself it was just a dream, just her mind playing tricks on her, but the whisper echoed in her mind, filling her with a sense of unease she couldn't shake. The next day, she told the others, expecting them to laugh it off, to tell her she was being ridiculous. But when she mentioned the whisper, their faces grew pale, their expressions tense with recognition and fear. "I heard it too," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible, her hands shaking as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "It was in my room last night. I thought it was just a dream, but it felt so real." The voice, it sounded like a little girl, so sad, so lonely. James and Danny exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of them admitted to hearing anything. They brushed it off, laughing nervously, but the laughter sounded hollow, forced, like they were trying to convince themselves more than anyone else. That night, the whisper returned, louder this time, filling their rooms with a cold, chilling dread that seemed to freeze the very air. Each of them heard it, the faint, insistent voice, calling out to them from the darkness, filling their minds with images of the doll's cracked face, its empty eyes, its tiny hands reaching out as if begging for comfort. Over the next few days, the hauntings grew worse, escalating in ways that defied explanation. They each began seeing the doll in strange places, in mirrors, in windows, even in their dreams. Its face was always twisted, its eyes wide and pleading, its voice a soft, insistent whisper that seemed to come from inside their own minds. "Stay with me." They tried to get rid of it, but the doll always seemed to return, appearing in impossible places, its presence a constant reminder of that night in the orphanage. Claire would throw it in the trash, only to find it on her bed the next morning, its cracked face staring up at her, its eyes glinting with what almost looked like amusement. James tried burning it in his backyard fire pit, but the flames left it untouched, its face still intact, its eyes still watching, still waiting. The hauntings grew more intense, the whisper louder, filling their minds, their dreams, their every waking thought. The doll's face seemed to follow them everywhere they went, its empty eyes watching, waiting, its voice growing louder, more insistent, more desperate with each passing day. Strange things began happening to each of them. Lisa would wake to find her room rearranged, toys she'd never owned scattered across the floor. Danny started losing time, finding himself in different places with no memory of how he got there. James's scientific equipment would malfunction, displaying impossible readings that spoke of energies that shouldn't exist. And Claire began to see her, the little girl in the white dress, standing in corners, watching with eyes that matched the doll's exactly. Finally, desperate and terrified, driven nearly mad by the constant haunting, they returned to the orphanage, hoping to find a way to end the curse that had taken hold of their lives. They climbed back up to the attic, their footsteps echoing through the empty hallways, the air thick with dread and the weight of decades of suffering. They set the doll down on the chair where they'd found it, backing away, their hearts pounding, their minds filled with a cold, suffocating fear that seemed to radiate from the very walls. The attic felt different now, more alive, as if the very space was watching them, waiting for something. For a moment, there was only silence, the stillness pressing down on them, heavy and thick with anticipation. And then, they heard it, the faint whispering voice, drifting through the darkness, filling their minds, their hearts, their very souls, with a loneliness so profound it brought tears to their eyes. Stay with me. The shadows seemed to close in, the walls pressing in around them, the air growing colder, thicker, as if the very building were alive, watching, waiting. The doll's eyes began to glow with an inner light, and in their depths, they could see flashes of the past, children crying in empty beds, harsh voices in the night, and a little girl, so very alone, clutching her doll and wishing for friends who would never leave her. And as the darkness swallowed them, they understood the terrible truth. The doll wasn't just an object, a simple toy left behind in an abandoned building. It was a vessel, a trap, a doorway for the spirit of Sarah Matthews, the child who had vanished all those years ago. She had never run away. She had been trapped, bound to the orphanage by loneliness and fear. Her spirit merged with the doll that had been her only friend. And now, they would be trapped with her, bound to the orphanage for eternity, their souls lost in its dark corridors, their voices joining the endless whisper that filled the empty, crumbling halls. They would become part of the legend, part of the story told in whispers, their fate a warning to others who might venture into places where the past refuses to die. And as the last echo of their screams faded into silence, the doll sat in its chair, waiting patiently, its cracked face watching, its empty eyes glinting in the darkness, ready for the next group of unwitting souls to come looking for a thrill. For in Willowbrook Orphanage, where the shadows never truly fade and the past holds on to its secrets with desperate hands, there will always be more stories to tell, more souls to collect, more friends to stay. Forever. The broken doll waits still, its cracked smile holding secrets that no living soul should know, its whispered invitation echoing through the halls of Willowbrook Orphanage. Stay with me. The desert heat was oppressive, radiating off the cracked earth in shimmering waves. For the Palmer family, the trip was meant to be a rare chance to bond, a desperately needed escape from the mounting tensions at home. Daniel, his wife Hannah, and their 9-year-old daughter, Lila, had spent the morning hiking a remote trail near Navajo Nation. The landscape stretched endlessly around them, barren and beautiful, painted in hues of rust and gold that seemed to shift with each passing cloud. Daniel watched his daughter bounce ahead on the trail, her pigtails swinging with each step. She'd been withdrawn lately, spending more time alone in her room than with them. This trip was his idea, a way to reconnect, to bridge the growing distance he felt between them all. Hannah had been skeptical, but she'd agreed they needed something to change. "Come on, Lila. We need to keep moving," Hannah called, shielding her eyes against the merciless sun. Her voice carried a note of anxiety that had become all too familiar lately. The vastness of the desert made her nervous, though she tried not to show it. "I found something." Lila's voice came from a small outcropping ahead, excitement breaking through her usual reserve. The sound of genuine enthusiasm in her voice made both parents' hearts lift. Daniel sighed, pulling off his wide-brimmed hat and wiping his forehead. Lila was always darting off to explore, a habit that both delighted and terrified them. The desert was no place for carelessness. "Stay where we can see you," he said, his voice carrying over the empty expanse. The words echoed slightly, bouncing off distant rock faces. When they caught up, Lila was crouched in the dirt, her fingers brushing at something half buried. The red earth had stained her shorts and dust coated her hands, but she didn't seem to notice. She looked up with a triumphant grin, holding out her discovery, a bracelet made of bone, its surface smooth and polished, carved with intricate spiraling patterns that seemed to move in the harsh sunlight. "Isn't it pretty?" she asked, slipping it onto her wrist before either parent could respond. The bone gleamed an unnatural white against her sun-tanned skin. The patterns carved into its surface were unlike anything Daniel had seen before. Not quite Native American, not quite anything else he could identify. Hannah frowned, her maternal instincts firing warning signals. "It looks old, Lila. You shouldn't..." She reached for the bracelet, but Lila pulled away, something flashing in her eyes that made Hannah's words die in her throat. "It's fine, Mom," Lila said, turning her arm to admire the way the bracelet caught the sunlight. "See? It fits perfectly." There was something in her voice that seemed different, a certainty that hadn't been there before, an edge that made both parents exchange worried glances. Daniel squatted beside her, examining the bracelet more closely. The bone was yellowed with age, but the carvings looked freshly cut, their edges sharp and clean. "Might be some kind of artifact," he muttered, unease prickling at the edges of his voice. The patterns seemed to shift when he looked at them directly, forming shapes that made his eyes hurt. "We should leave it here." "But I like it," Lila said, pouting. Her fingers traced the carvings possessively. "It's just a bracelet." The wind picked up suddenly, sending a spray of sand across their faces. In the distance, a crow called, its harsh cry echoing across the empty landscape. "Lila, take it off," Hannah said firmly, her mother's intuition screaming that something wasn't right. The air had grown cooler, though the sun still blazed overhead. "No!" Lila snapped, clutching her wrist protectively. The vehemence in her voice made both parents step back. Their normally compliant daughter had never spoken to them like that before. They exchanged a look but decided not to push the issue. It was just a bracelet, after all. What harm could it do? By the time they returned to their campsite, the sun was sinking low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert that seemed to reach for them like grasping fingers. The bracelet still encircled Lila's wrist, and she refused to let anyone touch it. She sat apart from them at dinner, picking at her food and staring into the gathering darkness. That night, the first dream came. Lila woke in a cold sweat, her small body trembling beneath her sleeping bag. She didn't cry out. Something in her told her to stay silent, to keep still, to wait. She had seen something. A figure, tall and gaunt, its skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too sharp, too angular to be human. It had stood at the edge of the campsite, staring at her with hollow eyes that glinted like shards of obsidian in the moonlight. The bracelet felt warm against her wrist, almost pulsing in time with her racing heart. Each beat sent tiny shivers of something racing through her veins. Not pain exactly, but a sensation that made her skin crawl and her thoughts scatter like startled birds. She glanced at her parents' tent, but stayed where she was, too afraid to move. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying a sound that might have been a coyote's howl or laughter. Deep, ancient laughter that seemed to come from the earth itself. The bracelet grew warmer. The next morning, Hannah noticed the marks on Lila's arm while helping her pack up camp. The sight made her stomach lurch. "What happened?" she asked, pulling Lila's arm toward her. Red welts circled her wrist, just below where the bracelet sat. They looked like scratches, but the pattern was too regular, too deliberate. The marks formed shapes that Hannah's eyes couldn't quite focus on, like trying to read words in a dream. "It doesn't hurt," Lila said, pulling her arm away. Her tone was distant, her eyes unfocused, staring at something beyond the horizon. The morning light cast strange shadows across her face, making her look older somehow, different. "I think it likes me." "What likes you?" Daniel asked, his stomach tightening at the strange cadence in his daughter's voice. The desert wind had died completely, leaving an unnatural stillness in the air. "The bracelet," Lila said simply. A smile played at the corners of her mouth, but it wasn't her usual expression. It was knowing, almost cruel. "It chose me." Hannah and Daniel exchanged worried glances. When Hannah tried to remove the bracelet, it wouldn't budge. The bone had molded to Lila's skin, as though it had grown into her flesh. The carvings seemed deeper now, more defined, and Hannah could have sworn they were different from the day before. "We're going to a hospital," Hannah said, panic creeping into her voice. She began throwing their belongings into the car, her movements frantic. "No," Lila said sharply. Her parents froze. The word seemed to echo in the still air, though she'd barely whispered it. "It doesn't want to go." On the drive to the nearest town, the air in the car grew stifling, despite the air conditioning running at full blast. Lila sat silently in the back seat, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where heat waves distorted the landscape into shifting, writhing shapes. Hannah tried to coax her into conversation, but Lila didn't respond. Her fingers traced the patterns on the bracelet endlessly, around and around. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the barren landscape pressing in on all sides like a closing fist. Daniel gripped the wheel tightly, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. The engine made strange sounds, whining and clicking in rhythms that seemed almost like words. "What's that?" Hannah asked suddenly, pointing through the windshield, her voice tight with fear. In the distance, a figure stood in the middle of the road. At first, it looked like a man, but as they approached, its proportions seemed wrong. Too tall, its arms and legs too thin, bent at angles that made Daniel's eyes water. Its head turned slowly to follow their car as they passed, though its body remained perfectly still. The sun caught its eyes, making them flash like polished stone. Daniel didn't stop. He didn't even look in the rearview mirror. He couldn't bear to see if it was following them. In the back seat, Lila hummed quietly to herself, a melody that made his teeth ache. By the time they reached the hospital, Lila's condition had worsened. She was pale, her skin clammy, and she refused to let go of her arm. The welts had spread up to her elbow, the red lines forming shapes that almost looked like letters in a language too old for human tongues. The emergency room staff exchanged worried looks as they examined her. The doctors couldn't remove the bracelet. Every attempt was met with Lila screaming in agony, her voice raw and inhuman, the sound making lights flicker and equipment malfunction. They suggested transferring her to a larger facility, but Daniel refused to wait. He had seen the shadows lengthening in the corners of the room, seen the way they seemed to reach for his daughter. "We're going back," he told Hannah that night, as they watched Lila through the observation window, back to where she found it. He didn't need to explain why. They both knew it was their only choice. The journey back to the outcropping felt interminable. Lila sat in the back seat, humming softly to herself, her head lolling against the window. Her voice was high and lilting, the melody strange and disjointed, words in a language that had never been meant for human ears. The bracelet glowed faintly in the growing darkness. "Lila, honey," Hannah said, turning to look at her daughter. The child who stared back wasn't entirely their Lila anymore. Something else looked out through her eyes. "Are you okay?" "It's here," Lila whispered, pressing her hand against the window. The glass frosted beneath her touch. "It's coming. It's hungry." A smile spread across her face, too wide, too knowing. Daniel drove faster, though the engine sputtered and complained. The desert seemed different now, the familiar landmarks twisted and wrong, as though the landscape itself was shifting around them. The sun hung too low in the sky, though his watch said it was only mid-afternoon. When they reached the site, the wind had picked up, swirling sand around them in patterns that looked almost like dancing figures. Lila climbed out of the car without prompting, her movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. The bracelet pulsed with a sickly light. "We need to put it back," Daniel said, his voice tight with fear and desperation. "Lila, where did you find it?" The wind carried his words away, transforming them into whispers and laughter. She didn't answer. She walked to the outcropping and stopped, staring down at the ground. The earth seemed to ripple beneath her feet, like something massive was stirring in the depths. "It's too late," she said, and both parents felt the truth in those words settle into their bones like ice. "It's awake now." The figure appeared at dusk, when the light painted the desert in shades of blood and shadow. Daniel and Hannah saw it at the same time, standing at the edge of the ridge. It was tall and emaciated, its skin ashen and cracked like ancient pottery. Its eyes gleamed like molten glass, and its mouth opened in a slow, deliberate grin that revealed too many teeth, all of them sharp and yellowed with age. The air around it shimmered with heat, though the temperature had dropped to near freezing. "What do you want?" Daniel shouted, stepping in front of Lila. His voice cracked with terror and fury. "Leave her alone." The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to move, jerking forward in sharp, unnatural motions, its limbs bending at impossible angles. The sound of cracking bones echoed across the desert, a symphony of pain that made Hannah's vision blur. Each step it took left the ground beneath it blackened and dead. Lila didn't flinch. She stared at the figure, her expression blank, almost reverent. The bracelet blazed with inner light, the carvings now clearly visible, symbols of power and hunger, of ancient pacts and terrible promises. "You can't take her!" Hannah screamed, grabbing Lila and pulling her close. She could feel her daughter's heart beating in time with the pulsing of the bracelet, and could feel the wrongness spreading through her child's body like poison. The figure stopped, its head tilted, as though considering. Then it raised one long skeletal arm and pointed at the bracelet. The meaning was clear. A trade, perhaps, or a test. The wind carried the scent of decay and ancient stone. Hannah ripped at the bracelet with renewed desperation, her fingers bleeding as she clawed at it. The bone was hot now, almost burning, but she didn't stop. Lila cried out, the sound reverberating through the canyon, making rocks tumble from the cliffs above. The bracelet snapped. Lila collapsed, gasping for air as the figure let out a sound, low and guttural, like a growl mixed with laughter. It reached down and picked up the broken bracelet, its movements now fluid, almost graceful. The bone fragments melted in its grip, flowing like water between its fingers. It faded into the shadows, leaving only the echoes of its voice and a promise written in the dust. A promise that it would return, that gifts once given could be offered again. The wind erased the words before Daniel could read them fully, but their meaning lingered like smoke in the air. They left the desert that night, Lila asleep in Hannah's arms, her skin cool and normal again. The marks on her arm had faded to nothing, though sometimes, in certain lights, Hannah thought she could still see the patterns beneath her daughter's skin. The bracelet lay broken in the dirt, its spiraling patterns fading as the wind buried it once again, waiting for the next curious hand to uncover it, waiting to be a gift once more. Daniel never spoke of what they saw, and Lila claimed not to remember. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled outside their windows, Hannah could swear she heard that laughter again, faint but unmistakable. And in those moments, she would check on Lila, watching her daughter sleep, making sure her arms were bare of any ornaments. And she always made sure the doors were locked, though deep down, she knew locks would mean nothing if it ever decided to return. For in the desert, ancient things still walk, and gifts are never given without a price. The fluorescent lights of Shibuya Station buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, artificial glow across the nearly empty platform. Kenji Yamamoto adjusted his tie, exhausted after another grueling day at the accounting firm. The clock on the wall read 11:42 p.m., another late night, another lonely commute home. That's when he first saw her. She stood at the far end of the platform, a solitary figure that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Her pale blue yukata, adorned with delicate cherry blossoms that appeared to float like spectral butterflies against the fabric, looked startlingly out of place among the modern architecture and electronic displays. The traditional garment hung perfectly still, despite the occasional draft that whistled through the station. Her black hair, straight and lustrous, cascaded down to her waist like a dark waterfall in the night. Something about her presence made the air feel thick, heavy, with an inexplicable tension that made it difficult to breathe. She stood frighteningly close to the platform's edge, her toes nearly hanging over the yellow safety line. The position made Kenji's stomach lurch. One small step, and she would plummet onto the tracks below. A salaryman hurried past, his briefcase swinging, and Kenji noticed how the man's eyes slid right past her, as if she were invisible. The few other late-night commuters seemed equally oblivious to her presence, their gazes focused on their phones or the ground before them. But to Kenji, she was impossible to ignore, like a tear in the fabric of reality. He took a hesitant step forward, drawn by an impulse he couldn't explain. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to stay away, but something deeper, more primal, pulled him toward her. The sound of his footsteps echoed hollowly across the platform, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she turned to face him, time seemed to stop. Her gaze was empty, devoid of any warmth or life, like looking into the depths of an abandoned well. The fluorescent lights above reflected in her dark eyes, creating pinpricks of cold, dead light that seemed to pierce straight through him. A chill ran down his spine, so intense it made his teeth chatter. The arrival of his train saved him, its thundering approach breaking whatever spell had held him transfixed. The rush of air and screech of metal on metal filled the station, and when he looked back to where she had been standing, the spot was empty. Just empty space and shadow where moments before she had stood. Kenji spent the entire ride home trying to rationalize what he had seen. It was festival season after all. Perhaps she had been attending a nearby celebration or ceremony. The emptiness in her eyes? A trick of the light, nothing more. The way she had vanished? He must have simply lost sight of her in the chaos of the arriving train. But deep down, he knew these explanations were lies he told himself to keep the creeping dread at bay. That night, he dreamed of her for the first time. In the dream, he stood on an endless platform that stretched into darkness in both directions. She stood at the edge, her back to him, her yukata glowing with an ethereal blue light. When he called out to her, his voice made no sound, as if the very air swallowed his words. She turned, slowly, impossibly slowly, and where her face should have been. He awoke with a gasp, his sheets soaked with sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. The digital clock by his bed read 3:33 a.m., and the shadows in his small apartment seemed deeper than usual, more alive. The next night, she was there again. Same spot, same stance, same yukata with its ghostly cherry blossoms. Kenji's breath caught in his throat when he saw her. He had spent the entire day convincing himself that the previous night had been a product of overwork and an overactive imagination. But there she was, real as the concrete beneath his feet, yet somehow less substantial than morning mist. He watched her from a distance, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the handle of his briefcase. Other commuters walked past, their shoulders sometimes passing through the space where her body stood, yet she remained undisturbed, like a projection or a memory made manifest. This time, when his train arrived, he kept his eyes fixed on her until the very last moment. Just before the doors closed, she turned her head, ever so slightly, and he could have sworn he saw the corner of where her mouth should have been begin to curve upward. The pattern continued, night after night. She became a constant, haunting presence in his life, as reliable as the setting sun. Each encounter left him feeling more drained, as if she were somehow feeding off his vital energy from afar. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and his colleagues began to comment on his haggard appearance. "Yamamoto-san, are you feeling all right?" his supervisor asked one afternoon, concern evident in his voice. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Kenji laughed weakly at the unintentional accuracy of the statement. "Just having trouble sleeping lately," he replied, avoiding eye contact. How could he explain that every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, or rather, the absence of her face, staring back at him? Mr. Tanaka, the elderly maintenance worker who had been with the company for decades, watched him with knowing eyes. During their lunch break, the old man approached Kenji's desk, his weathered face creased with worry. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said, settling into a chair beside Kenji. "This trouble sleeping, does it have anything to do with the station?" Kenji's chopsticks froze halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" Mr. Tanaka leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've worked here a long time, seen many things. Sometimes late at night, when the platforms are almost empty." He paused, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "There are stories, you see. Old stories about a girl in a yukata." Kenji's blood ran cold. "What kind of stories?" "They say she appears to those who are marked," Mr. Tanaka continued, his eyes distant. "Those whose time is drawing near. She was once like them, they say, a young woman who took her own life at the station many years ago. Now she wanders the platforms, searching for others to join her." "Join her?" Kenji's voice cracked slightly. Mr. Tanaka's expression was grave. "In death, Yamamoto-san, she chooses those who will soon follow her path, whether by their own hand or by fate's design. She watches them, follows them, calls to them." He shuddered. "I've seen her myself once, many years ago, the night before my wife." He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, but Kenji understood. The rest of the day passed in a blur of terror and speculation. He considered taking a taxi home, but something told him it wouldn't matter. She would find him regardless. That night, he made a decision that would seal his fate. As he stood on the platform, watching her familiar figure in the distance, he gathered his courage and approached her. Each step felt like walking through deep water, the air growing thicker, colder as he drew near. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. When she turned, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Where her features should have been, there was only smooth, pale flesh, like a blank canvas. Only her eyes remained, dark and bottomless, fixed upon him with an intensity that made his soul shrivel. The encounter marked a turning point. After that night, she began appearing everywhere. He would catch glimpses of her in windows, mirrors, puddles on the street. Sometimes in the corner of his eye, he would see her standing in his office or at the foot of his bed. Her presence became a constant shadow over his life, driving him slowly but surely toward the edge of sanity. The whispers started a week later. At first, they were so faint he thought he was imagining them. A soft, feminine voice calling his name in the dark hours of the night. But they grew stronger, more insistent, until they filled his head like a chorus of the damned. "Kenji, come with me." He began to lose track of time. Days blurred together in a haze of terror and exhaustion. He stopped going to work, stopped answering his phone, stopped eating. His apartment became a prison, yet nowhere felt safe. She was always there, watching, waiting, her presence growing stronger as his grip on reality grew weaker. One night, as he lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling with bloodshot eyes, he heard her voice clearer than ever before. "Kenji, I'm waiting." He sat up, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. The room was dark, but he could see her standing in the doorway, her yukata glowing with that ethereal blue light from his dreams. Her blank face turned toward him, those endless eyes fixing him in place. "Kenji, come with me." Her hand reached out, pale and slender, beckoning him forward. The air in the room grew so cold he could see his breath, and the shadows seemed to writhe and dance around her figure. He tried to resist, tried to look away, but her gaze held him captive. In that moment, he understood what Mr. Tanaka had meant. She wasn't just a ghost, wasn't just an omen. She was something older, something darker, a force as ancient and inevitable as death itself. And she had chosen him. As her cold fingers brushed against his skin, Kenji felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The terror that had gripped him for so long melted away, replaced by a numbness that spread through his body like ice water in his veins. The last thing he saw was her face, no longer blank, but beautiful and terrible. Her mouth finally visible and curved into a gentle smile. And as the darkness claimed him, her final whisper echoed through his fading consciousness. "Welcome home, Kenji." They found his body the next morning, lying peacefully in his bed, his expression serene despite the horror that had preceded his final moments. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but those who knew him, who had seen the change in him over those final weeks, wondered about the truth. And at the station, as the sun sets and the platforms grow quiet, she still stands there, waiting, watching, choosing. Her pale blue yukata moving slightly in a breeze that doesn't exist. Her dark hair hanging straight and perfect. Her eyes scanning the crowd for the next soul, marked to join her in the endless night. Some say, if you find yourself alone on the platform late at night, and you see a girl in a yukata standing too close to the edge, it's best to look away. Don't meet her gaze. Don't acknowledge her presence. And if you hear a soft voice calling your name, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. But deep down, you'll know it won't matter. Because once she chooses you, once she marks you as her next companion, there's no escape. She'll wait for you. She'll always wait for you. Until the day you finally join her on that eternal platform, where the trains never come and the night never ends. Lila Hayashi loved her job as a customer service representative at Green Line Services, a major furniture retailer. While others dreaded the endless stream of complaints and demands, she thrived on problem solving, diffusing tense situations, and helping people navigate their issues. The anonymity of the role suited her introverted nature. She liked being a calm voice on the other end of the line, far removed from the physical presence of the customers she served. Behind her headset and computer screen, she felt safe, protected by distance and protocol. That all changed on a Tuesday afternoon in October, when she answered a call that would turn her carefully structured world upside down. "Thank you for calling Greenline Services. This is Lila speaking. How can I assist you today?" Her voice carried its usual professional warmth, practiced but genuine. The voice on the other end was male, deep but polite, with an accent she couldn't quite place. "Hi, yes. I have a question about your TV stands, specifically the redwood model. Do you have it in black?" Lila smiled, glad for what seemed like a straightforward inventory question. These were her favorite calls. Simple, direct, easily resolved. "Let me check on that for you," she replied, fingers already moving across her keyboard to access the inventory system. As she navigated through the database, the man spoke again, his tone shifting slightly. "You're very professional. I like that. Your voice has a nice quality to it." Lila blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the personal observation. "Thank you," she replied cautiously, maintaining her professional demeanor while subtle warning bells began to ring in her mind. "We do have the redwood in black. Would you like me to check stock at your nearest location?" "Sure," he said, pausing for a moment before adding, "By the way, do you like your new red curtains? The ones you hung in your living room yesterday?" The question landed like a physical blow. Lila froze, the blood draining from her face as her fingers hovered motionless over the keyboard. The curtains, deep burgundy with a subtle pattern. She had indeed hung them just yesterday evening, working alone in her apartment. "I'm sorry?" she managed, her voice wavering despite her best efforts to maintain composure. "They suit you," the man said, his tone as casual as if they were discussing the weather. "They make the room feel cozy, especially in the evening, when you're sitting on the couch with your laptop." Lila ended the call without another word, her hands trembling as she placed the receiver back in its cradle. She hadn't told anyone about the curtains, not her family, not her friends, not even her sister who usually heard about every minor change to her apartment. She had only bought them 2 days ago, a spontaneous purchase from a small home goods store on her way home from work. That evening, she locked all her doors and windows, checking each twice. The curtains, the ones he'd mentioned, were drawn tightly shut, but now, instead of making her feel protected, they felt like a connection to the stranger on the phone, a tangible reminder that someone was watching. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Every creak of the floorboards in her old apartment building, every rustle of the wind against the windows, sent her heart racing. She found herself avoiding the living room, taking a circuitous route through her apartment to avoid passing by those burgundy curtains that now seemed to mock her with their presence. As she lay in bed, trying to convince herself she was being paranoid, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was from an unknown number, the message preview making her stomach lurch. "Why'd you hang up? We were having such a nice chat. The black TV stand would look perfect under your window, by the way. I can help you set it up." Lila sat upright, her breath caught in her throat. She blocked the number with trembling fingers and put her phone on silent. But sleep eluded her. Every shadow in her bedroom seemed to shift and move, and the darkness beyond her windows felt alive with malevolent intent. The calls started the next day, filtering through Greenline's customer service system like poison. At first, they were infrequent, just a ring or two before stopping, the caller ID showing different numbers each time. Then they came more often, relentless and demanding, sometimes back to back. Each time she answered, there was only silence on the other end, broken occasionally by the sound of soft breathing. Lila reported the calls to her manager, Karen, but they dismissed it as a prank. "It happens," they said with a shrug, barely looking up from their computer. "Some people get bored and harass customer service reps. Just ignore it. They'll move on to someone else eventually." But ignoring it didn't work. If anything, It seemed to make him more persistent. The next call came while she was on her lunch break, her personal phone buzzing against the break room table. She hesitated before answering, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Hello?" she said, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound strong. "You left your bedroom light on last night," the man said, his voice somehow both intimate and threatening. "Until 2:47 a.m. to be exact. Trouble sleeping, Lila? Are you worried about something?" By the end of the week, Lila had filed a police report, sitting across from a detective who took notes with mechanical precision as she described the calls, the messages, the growing sense of being watched. The officers took her statement but offered little comfort, their expressions suggesting they'd heard similar stories before. "It could be a case of phone spoofing," one of them suggested, closing his notebook with an air of finality. "They might not even know where you live. It's all digital tricks these days. Hackers can make it seem like they know more than they do." But Lila wasn't convinced. The calls were too specific, too invasive, filled with details that couldn't be gleaned from hacking alone. He knew her movements, her habits, the exact layout of her apartment. That night, she installed security cameras around her apartment, positioning them carefully to cover every entrance and window. She kept her phone by her side, the police number on speed dial, ready to call at the first sign of trouble. The first camera alert came at 2:37 a.m., her phone buzzing against her nightstand like an angry wasp. Her stomach churned as she opened the live feed, the blue light of her screen illuminating her face in the darkness. At first, she saw nothing, just the shadowy outline of her front door and the faint glow of the porch light casting more shadows than illumination. But then, a figure stepped into view. The man stood perfectly still, his face obscured by the hood of a dark jacket. He didn't move for several minutes, just staring directly into the camera lens, as if he knew she was watching. His stillness was more terrifying than any movement would have been. Lila's hand shook as she dialed the police, her other hand clutching her bedsheet like a shield. "Someone's outside my apartment," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's just standing there, watching." The dispatcher stayed on the line until the officers arrived, their sirens silent but lights painting her walls with rotating bars of red and blue. But by the time they got there, the man was gone, leaving nothing behind but footprints in the dewy grass below her window. The next morning, Lila found a note taped to her door, the paper expensive and thick, the handwriting elegant and controlled. "You didn't answer last night. That's not very polite. Customer service representatives should know better." She called the police again, but they had no leads. The cameras hadn't captured the man's face, and the note, when tested, didn't have any fingerprints. It was as if her stalker was a ghost, leaving traces of his presence, but nothing concrete enough to track. "Stay vigilant," the officer advised, adding her case to what seemed like an endless pile of similar reports. "Keep recording everything. Eventually, they make a mistake." Lila didn't leave her apartment for days, calling in sick to work until finally quitting altogether, convinced the calls would stop if she wasn't reachable through Green Line's system. But the silence only made the paranoia worse, giving her too much time to jump at shadows and analyze every small sound. One night, as she sat on her couch scrolling through her phone, researching ways to disappear, to change her identity, the room plunged into darkness. The power had gone out, not just in her apartment, but in the entire building, the sudden darkness feeling thick and intentional. Her heart raced as she fumbled for a flashlight, the glow of her phone screen barely illuminating the room. As if on cue, it buzzed with a new message that made her blood freeze. "Do you like the dark? I prefer the curtains open. Why don't you take a look outside? I have something to show you." Lila turned toward the windows, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The curtains were still drawn, but she felt it, a presence, just beyond the fabric. A shadow moved against the burgundy material, faint but unmistakable, like a dark puppet show playing out inches from her face. She ran to the bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. Her breathing was ragged as she pressed her back against the door, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The beam darted around the room, transforming familiar objects into menacing shapes. Then came the tapping. It was soft at first, a gentle knock, knock, knock against the bedroom window, like someone trying to wake her from a nightmare. But this was no dream. "Lila," the man's voice called, muffled but clear through the glass. "You should see what's outside. I brought you a gift." She didn't move, didn't breathe, trying to make herself invisible in the darkness. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, developing a rhythm that seemed to match her racing heartbeat. "Look, Lila, I picked these just for you. Red, like your curtains, like your lips when you're afraid." Her flashlight beam, moving of its own accord, landed on the window. A bouquet of red roses pressed against the glass, held by a pale hand with long, elegant fingers. The roses were deep crimson, almost black in the darkness, their thorny stems leaving scratches on the window. And beyond the roses, she saw his face for the first time, smiling, patient, waiting. He looked ordinary, almost handsome, like someone she might have helped at work. But his eyes were wrong, too bright, too focused, reflecting her flashlight beam like a cat's. When the police arrived, they found Lila huddled in the corner of her bedroom, clutching her phone like a talisman. The man was gone, but the roses remained, scattered across the ground outside her window, like drops of blood on the grass. Despite their efforts, despite the cameras and the fingerprints and the increased patrols, they never caught him. He vanished as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving only his flowers and his memory behind. Months later, Lila moved to a new apartment in a different city, using a name that wasn't hers. She deleted her social media accounts, changed her number, and tried to start fresh. She took a job that kept her away from phones, away from customer service, away from the voices of strangers. But one evening, as she unpacked a box of belongings in her new place, she found a familiar note slipped between the folds of her clothing. The paper was still thick and expensive, the handwriting still elegant and precise. "I still love the curtains. The new blue ones suit this apartment better, though. Shall we talk about interior design again sometime? I've been missing your voice." And somewhere in the city, a phone began to ring. The cabin wasn't much to look at. Its weathered logs sagged slightly under the weight of years, and the tin roof was patched with mismatched scraps of metal that gleamed dully in the mountain sunlight. But to David, it was perfect. After his divorce, a messy affair that left him emotionally drained and questioning everything he thought he knew about his life, he needed a place to escape, a sanctuary far from city noise and memories he'd rather leave behind. The constant reminders of his failed marriage, the empty side of the bed, the gaps in photo albums, the pitying looks from friends, had become too much to bear. Nestled deep in the Colorado Rockies, surrounded by towering pines and rugged peaks that seemed to touch the sky, the cabin had belonged to an old friend of his late father. Marcus Wheeler had been a bit of an eccentric, spending his later years in almost complete isolation, but he'd always had a soft spot for David's father. The property passed to David on a technicality when Marcus passed away, a detail in an ancient will that somehow survived probate. It had been years since anyone stayed there, but David saw its potential beneath the decay. A little TLC, he thought, and this place could be a real retreat, a chance to rebuild himself away from the chaos of his old life. The first week passed without issue, filled with the satisfying exhaustion of physical labor. David cleaned years of dust and debris, sanded rough floors until they gleamed, and patched up the drafty windows that rattled in the mountain wind. The isolation, initially jarring after years of city living, began to feel like a welcome reprieve. His phone barely got signal, and the nearest town was an hour's drive away. Each night, he'd sit on the creaking porch with a beer, listening to the wind whisper through the pines and watching the stars blaze against the black canvas of the sky. Up here, away from city lights, the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like spilled diamonds. It was during one of those quiet evenings that David noticed the first symbol, a discovery that would mark the beginning of his descent into terror. He'd been tearing down some old, moldy wallpaper in the bedroom, the musty smell of decay filling his nostrils, when his scraper snagged on something beneath the surface. Curious, he pulled the paper away, revealing a carved figure etched into the wood. It looked like a stick figure with unnaturally long limbs, its head tilted at an unnatural angle that made his skin crawl. The carving was precise, too deliberate to be random vandalism. Creepy, David muttered, running his fingers over the carving. The grooves felt smooth, as though the wood had been worn down by years of touch, like countless hands before his had traced the same unsettling pattern. He took a photo, intending to look it up later, and got back to work, though his eyes kept drifting back to the figure's tilted head. That night, he dreamed of the figure. In the surreal landscape of his nightmare, it moved in halting, jerking steps, its limbs bending in impossible ways that defied anatomy and physics. When it turned to face him, its blank, featureless head tilted, as if questioning his presence in its domain. David jolted awake, his breath ragged and heart racing, sheets tangled around him like restraints. Just a nightmare, he whispered to himself, though the image lingered, vivid and sharp in his mind's eye. The darkness of the cabin seemed thicker somehow, more oppressive. The next day brought another discovery that made his blood run cold. He found another carving, this time on the wall near the fireplace, partially hidden behind an old painting. It was identical to the first, though the head seemed tilted in the opposite direction, as if this figure was responding to its counterpart. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the crisp mountain air, the precision of the carvings, their hidden placement. It spoke of purpose, of meaning he couldn't decipher. Later, while splitting wood outside, the rhythmic thunk of his axe echoing through the trees, he spotted the same figure carved into a nearby pine. This time, it wasn't alone. Other stick figures surrounded it, their limbs tangled in strange, almost ritualistic patterns that made his eyes hurt to follow. David's stomach churned as he realized the implications. He hadn't noticed these when he'd arrived, but now they seemed to be everywhere, watching from their wooden prison. He decided to chalk it up to local superstition, a rational explanation to quiet his growing unease. Probably some bored kids messing around years ago, he told himself, but the explanation felt hollow, like trying to bandage a wound that ran too deep. The first night he heard the scratching, David assumed it was an animal, a natural explanation for an unnatural sound. The cabin was old, and it wasn't unheard of for squirrels or raccoons to scurry across the roof. But the sound wasn't random, didn't follow the patterns of small creatures seeking shelter. It came in deliberate bursts, as though someone, or something, was dragging a clawed hand along the walls, marking its territory. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the cold biting through his flannel shirt like hungry teeth. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, revealing only the forest and the silent outline of the cabin, its windows like dead eyes staring into the night. Yet the moment he stepped back inside, the scratching resumed, louder now, more insistent. By morning, David's nerves were frayed from lack of sleep and growing paranoia. He decided to take a long hike, hoping the fresh air would clear his mind and provide a rational perspective. But the deeper he ventured into the woods, the more unsettling the forest became. Every so often, he found another carving, etched into trees or rocks, with the same meticulous care. They seemed to form a path, though to where, he couldn't say. The figures appeared to be moving, their positions shifting slightly from one carving to the next, as though telling a story he was afraid to understand. David turned back, his unease mounting with each step. As he approached the cabin, he stopped short, his breath caught in his throat like a trapped bird. His hands began to shake, and the water bottle he'd been carrying slipped from his grasp, forgotten. There was a new carving on the cabin door, larger than the others and more intricate, impossible to have missed earlier. It depicted a stick figure with elongated arms that stretched outward, encircling smaller figures in what might have been an embrace or a trap. At the center of the cluster was a carving that looked eerily like a face. David's face, rendered in simple lines but unmistakable in its accuracy. The eyes were hollow, endless pits that seemed to follow him as he backed away. That night, the noises escalated beyond anything he could rationalize. The scratching grew louder, joined by faint whispers that seemed to drift through the cracks in the walls, like poisonous smoke. The voices spoke in a language he didn't understand, yet their tone carried meaning. Hunger, anticipation, ancient patience finally wearing thin. David sat in the corner of the living room, clutching the rifle his father had left behind, his eyes darting to every shadow that shifted in the firelight. The darkness seemed alive, breathing with malevolent purpose. Around midnight, the whispering stopped. For a brief, terrifying moment, there was silence so complete, it felt suffocating, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Then came the knock, the sound he'd been dreading since finding the first carving. 3 sharp, deliberate raps on the front door, each impact resonating through the cabin like a gunshot. David froze, his mind racing between flight and fight responses, primal instincts screaming for survival. When the knock came again, louder this time, he forced himself to his feet and approached the door, the floorboards creaking beneath each hesitant step. "Who's there?" His voice cracked, barely audible over the pounding of his pulse in his ears. The silence that answered seemed to mock his fear. He swung the door open, the rifle raised with trembling hands. The porch was empty, save for the night wind whistling through the trees like a distant scream. But as he turned to retreat inside, his flashlight caught movement near the edge of the forest. A figure, tall and thin, stepped behind a tree, its limbs impossibly long and fluid, moving in ways that defied natural law. David slammed the door shut, his heart thundering against his ribs. The next morning, bathed in deceptively peaceful sunlight, he resolved to leave. As he loaded his truck with shaking hands, he noticed fresh carvings that hadn't been there the night before. More figures, their arms outstretched as though reaching for him, beckoning him to join their eternal dance. They covered the walls of the cabin now, etched deep into the wood with impossible speed and precision. When he turned the key in the ignition, the truck coughed but didn't start, the engine remaining stubbornly silent, despite his increasingly desperate attempts. He tried again and again, but the machine refused to respond, as though something had drained its life away. Panic surged through him as reality sank in. He was trapped, cut off from the world, by miles of wilderness, and whatever force had claimed this territory as its own. David spent the rest of the day pacing, his thoughts spiraling into dread. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in colors that seemed too vivid to be real, he realized he hadn't seen any wildlife all day. No birds sang in the trees, no deer moved through the underbrush, nothing but the oppressive stillness of the forest, as though every living thing had fled from what was coming. That night, he didn't bother with the fire. He sat in darkness, the rifle across his lap, waiting for what he knew would come. The knocking began as soon as true night fell, followed by whispers that seemed to seep through the walls like black water. He didn't open the door this time. Instead, he pressed his back against the wall, praying for a dawn he wasn't sure would arrive. At some point, exhaustion claimed him despite his terror. He awoke to faint light filtering through the window, but relief was short-lived. The carvings had spread overnight, covering every surface of the cabin, including the floor and ceiling. The stick figures seemed to writhe in the early morning light, their limbs overlapping in a chaotic, suffocating mass that made his vision blur when he tried to focus on any single image. David didn't waste time. He grabbed a backpack, stuffed it with supplies, and set off on foot, determined to reach the nearest town no matter what stood in his way. The woods felt alive around him, the trees closing in as though trying to swallow him whole, their branches reaching like grasping fingers. Hours passed, and the forest seemed endless, a maze designed to keep him trapped. No matter which direction he turned, he found himself surrounded by carvings, their numbers increasing with each step. It was as though the figures were guiding him somewhere, herding him toward some inevitable conclusion. By the time the sun began to set, David realized he was hopelessly lost, his attempts at navigation thwarted by a landscape that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. When he stumbled into the clearing, he thought, for a brief moment, that he'd found salvation. Then he saw the cabin, and his last hopes crumbled to dust. It was his cabin, the same sagging logs, the same patched roof, but now completely covered in carvings that seemed to pulse with inner light. The markings on the walls seemed to shimmer in the twilight, the stick figures twisting and shifting as though alive, dancing their ancient, terrible dance. The door creaked open, though no one stood behind it, revealing only darkness deeper than any natural shadow. David backed away, shaking his head in denial. No, this isn't real. It can't be real. But he knew, with the certainty of the damned, that it was more real than anything he'd ever known. The whispers began again, louder now, surrounding him in a chorus of inhuman voices. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision, and when he turned, he saw them. The figures from the carvings, stepping out of the forest like nightmares made flesh, their limbs unnaturally long, their heads tilting in unison as they regarded their prey. They didn't have faces, but David felt their gaze pierce through him, hollow and infinite, filled with the weight of centuries. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night, claimed by the darkness like everything else. The last thing he saw was the cabin door closing, the darkness consuming him with the finality of an ancient hunger finally satisfied. When hikers discovered the cabin months later, drawn by reports of a missing person, they found it empty, save for the carvings that covered every surface like a skin of symbols. At the center of the floor was a single figure, carved larger and deeper than the others, its craftsmanship so precise it seemed to move in the beam of their flashlights. Its face, unmistakably, was David's, frozen in an expression of eternal terror. The hikers fled, but the story spread through whispered conversations in local bars and around campfires. They say that on quiet nights, when the moon is hidden and the wind moves through the pines like searching fingers, you can still hear knocking from within the cabin. 3 sharp raps, followed by silence, as though something is waiting to be let out, or perhaps inviting others to be let in. Some doors once opened can never truly be closed again,